I'm Pat Tully of the Ketchikan Public Library, and this is Reading Aloud. This evening I'm reading two articles by William Allen White. William Allen White was born in 1868 in Emporia, Kansas, and when he was still in his 20s, he purchased the newspaper the Emporia Gazette, serving as its owner, editor, and journalist. He was also a short story writer and novelist. The first piece I'm reading is about his hometown of Emporia, published in 1906. Let's get started. Scribes and Pharisees by William Allen White. Ours is a little town in that part of the country called the West by those who live east of the Alleghanies, and referred to lovingly as back east by those who dwell west of the Rockies. It is a country town where, as the song goes, you know everybody and they all know you, and the country newspaper office is the social clearinghouse. When a man has published a paper in a country community for many years, he knows his town and its people, their strength and their weakness, their joys and their sorrows, their failings and their prosperity. Or if he does not know these things, he is on the road to failure, for this knowledge must be the spirit of his paper. The country editor and his reporters, sooner or later, pass upon everything that interests their town. In our little newspaper office, we are all reporters, and we know many intimate things about our people that we do not print. We know, for instance, which wives will not let their husbands endorse other men's notes at the banks. We know about the row the Baptists are having to get rid of the bass singer in their choir, who has sung at funerals for 30 years, until it has reached a point where all good Baptists dread death on account of his lugubrious profundo. Perhaps we should take this tragedy to heart, but we know that the Methodists are having the same trouble with their soprano, who flats, and has flatted for 10 years and is too proud to quit the choir under fire, as she calls it, and we remember what a time the Congregationalists had getting rid of their tenor. So that choir troubles are to us only a part of the grist that keeps the mill going. As the merest incident of the daily grind, it came to the office that the bank cashier, whose retirement we announced with half a column of regret, was caught $3,500 short after 20 years of faithful service, and that his wife sold the homestead to make his shortage good. We know the week that the widower sets out, and we hear with remarkable accuracy just when he has been refused by this particular widow or that. And when he begins on a school teacher, the whole office has candy and cigar and mince pie bets on the result, with the odds on the widower 5-1. We know the woman who is always sent for when a baby comes to town, and who has laid more good people of the community in their shrouds than all the undertakers. We know the politician who gets $5 a day for his services at the polls, the man who takes $3, and the man who will work for the good of the cause in the precious hope of a blessed reward at some future county convention. To know these things is not a matter of pride. It is not a source of annoyance or shame. It is part of the business. Though our loathed but esteemed contemporary, the statesman, speaks of our town as this city and calls the marshal chief of police, we are nonetheless a country town. Like hundreds of its kind, our little daily newspaper is equipped with typesetting machines and is printed from a web-perfecting press. Yet it is only a country newspaper, and knowing this, we refuse to put on city airs. Of course, we print the afternoon Associated Press report on the first page, under the formal heads and with some pretense of dignity. But that first page is the parlor of the paper, as it is of most of its contemporaries, and in the other pages they and we go about in our shirt sleeves, calling people by their first names, teasing the boys and girls good-naturedly, tickling the pompous members of the village family with straws from time to time, and letting out the family secrets of the community without much regard for the feelings of the supercilious. 9 or 10,000 people in our town go to bed on this kind of mental pabulum, as do country town dwellers all over the United States. And although we do not claim that it is helpful, we do contend that it does not hurt them. Certainly by poking mild fun at the shams, the town Pharisees, we make it more difficult to maintain the class lines which the pretenders would establish. Possibly by printing the news of everything that happens, suppressing nothing on account of the respectability of the parties concerned, we may prevent some evildoers from going on with their plans. But this is mere conjecture, and we do not set it down to our credit. What we maintain is that in printing our little country dailies, we, the scribes, from one end of the world to the other, get more than our share of fun out of life as we go along, and pass as much of it on to our neighbors as we can spare. Because we live in a country town, where the only car gongs we hear are on the baker's wagon, and where the horses in the fire department work in the streets, is no reason why city dwellers should assume that we are natives. We have no dialect worth recording, save that some of us Westerners burr our R's a little, or drop an occasional final G. But you will find that all the things advertised in the backs of the magazines are in our houses, and that the young men in our towns walking home at midnight, with their coats over their arms, whistle the same popular airs that lovelorn boys are whistling in New York, Portland, San Francisco, or New Orleans that same fine evening. Our girls are those pretty, reliant, well-dressed young women that you see at summer resorts from Coronado Beach to Buzzards Bay. In the fall and winter, these girls fill the colleges of the East and the state universities of the West. Those wholesome, frank, good-natured people whom you met last winter at the Grand Canyons and who told you of the funny performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin in Yiddish at the People's Theater on the east side of New York, and insisted that you see the totem pole in Seattle, and then take a cottage for a month at Catalina Island, who gave you the tip about Absam's quaint little beefsteak chop house up an alley in Chicago, who told you of Mrs. O'Hagan's second-hand furniture shop in Charleston, where you can get real colonial stuff dirt cheap. Those people are our leading citizens, who run the bank or the dry goods store or the flour mill. At our annual Arts and Crafts Show, we have on exhibition loot from the four corners of the earth, and the club woman who has not heard it whispered around in our art circles that Mr. Sargent is painting too many portraits lately, and that a certain long-legged model, whose face is familiar in the weekly magazines, is no better than she should be. A club woman in our town who does not know of these things is out of caste in clubdom, and women say of her that she is giving too much time to the church. We take all the beautiful garden magazines, and our terracotta works are turning out creditable vases, which we pronounce vases, you may be sure, for formal gardens. And though we men, for the most part, run our own lawnmowers, and personally look after the work of the college boy who takes care of the horse and the cow for his room, still there are a few of us proud and haughty creatures who have automobiles, and go snorting around the country, scaring horses and tooting terror into herds by the roadside. But the bright young reporters on our papers do not let an automobile come to town without printing an item stating its make and its cost, and whether or not it is a new one or a second-hand one, and what speed it can make. At the flower parade in our little town last October, there were 10 automobiles in line, decked with paper flowers and laden with pretty girls in lawns and dimities and linens. And our particular little country paper printed an item to the effect that the real social line of cleavage in the town lies not between the cut glass set and the devotees of hand-painted china, but between the real nobility who wear genuine linen and those who wear the base imitations. In some towns, an item like that would make people mad, but we have our people trained to stand a good deal. They know it costs them 5 cents a line for cards of thanks and resolutions of respect, so they never bring them in. They know that our paper never permits one who was there to report social functions, so that dear old correspondent has resigned. And because we have insisted for years on making an item about the first tomatoes that are served in spring at any dinner or reception, together with the cost per pound of the tomatoes, the town has become used to our attitude and does not buzz with indignation when we poke a risible finger at the homemade costumes of the Plymouth Daughters when they present the Mikado to pay for the new pipe organ. Indeed, so used is the town to our ways that when there was great talk last winter about Mrs. Frelinghuysen serving fresh strawberries over ice cream at her luncheon in February, just after her husband had gone through bankruptcy, she called up Miss Larrabee, our society editor, on the telephone and asked her to make a little item saying that the strawberries served by Mrs. Frelinghuysen at her luncheon were not fresh, but merely sun-dried. This we did gladly and printed her recipe. So used is this town to our school teachers resigning to get married that when one resigns for any other reason, we make it a point to announce in the paper that it is not for the usual reason and tell our readers exactly what the young woman is going to do. So, gradually, without our intending to establish it, a family vernacular has grown up in the paper, which our people understand, but which, like all other family vernaculars, is Greek to those outside the circle. Thus we say, Bill Parker is making his 8th biennial distribution of cigars today for a boy. City papers would print it, born to Mr. and Mrs. W. H. Parker, a baby boy. Again, we print this item. Mrs. Merriman is getting ready to lend her fern to the Nortons, June 15th. That doesn't mean anything, unless you happen to know that Mrs. Merriman has the prettiest Boston fern in town, and that no bow window is properly decorated at any wedding without that fern. In larger towns, the same news item would appear thus. Cards are out announcing the wedding of Miss Cecil Norton and Mr. Collis R. Hatcher at the home of the bride's parents, Mr. and Mrs. T.J. Norton, 1022 High Street, June 15th. A plain drunk is generally referred to in our columns as a guest of Marshal Ferguson's informal house party. And when a group of drunken disorderlies is brought in, we feel free to say of their evening diversion that they spent the happy hours after refreshments playing progressive hell. And this brings us to the consideration of the most important personage with whom we have to deal. In what we call social circles, the most important personages are Mrs. Julia Neal Worthington and Mrs. Priscilla Winthrop Conklin, who keep 2 hired girls and can pay $5 a week for them when the prevailing price is $3. In financial circles, the most important personage is John Markley, who buys real estate mortgages. In political circles, the most important personage is Charlie Hedrick, who knows the railroad attorneys at the Capitol and always can get passes for the county delegation to the state convention. In the railroad yards, the most important personage is the division superintendent, who smokes 10-cent cigars and has the only room with a bath at the Hotel Metropole. But with us, in the publication of our newspaper, the most important personage in town is Marshal Ferguson. If you ever looked out of the car window as you passed through town, you undoubtedly saw him at the depot, walking nervously up and down the platform, peering into the faces of strangers. He is ever on the outlook for crooks, though nothing more violent has happened in our county for years than an assault and battery. But Marshal Ferguson never relinquishes his watch. In winter, clad in his blue uniform and campaign hat, he is a familiar figure on our streets. And in summer, without coat or vest, with his big silver star in which is stamped Chief of Police, pinned to his suspender, he may be seen at any point where trouble is least likely to break out. He is the only man on the town site whom we are afraid to tease, because he is our chief source of news. For if we ruffle his temper, he sees to it that our paper misses the details of the next chicken raid that comes under his notice. He can bring us to time in short order. When we particularly desire to please him, we refer to him as the authorities. If the palace grocery has been invaded through the back window and a box of plug tobacco stolen, Marshal Ferguson is delighted to read in the paper that the authorities have an important clue and the arrest may be expected at any time. He is the authorities. If the authorities have their eye on a certain barber shop on South Main Street, which is supposed to be doing a backdoor beer business, he is again the authorities, and contends that the word strikes more terror into the hearts of evildoers than the mere name Marshal Ferguson. Next in rank to the authorities in the diplomatic corps of the office come our advertisers, the proprietors of the White Front Dry Goods Store, the Golden Eagle Clothing Store, and the Beehive. These men can come nearer to dictating the paper's policy than the bankers and politicians, who are supposed to control country newspapers. Though we are charged with being the organ of any of a half-dozen politicians whom we happen to speak of kindly at various times, we have little real use for politicians in our office, and a businessman who brings in $60 or $70 worth of advertising every month has more influence with us than all the politicians in the county. This is the situation in most newspaper offices that succeed when any other situation prevails. When politicians control editors, the newspapers don't pay well, and sooner or later the politicians are bankrupt. The only person in town whom all the merchants desire us to poke fun at is Mail Order Petrie. Mail Order Petrie is a miserly old codger who buys everything out of town that he can buy a penny cheaper than the home merchants sell it. He is a hard-working man so far as that goes, and so stingy that he has been accused of going barefooted in the summertime to save shoes. When he is sick, he sends out of town for patent medicines, and for 10 years he worked in his truck garden, fighting floods and droughts, bugs and blight, to save something like $100, which he put in a mail-order blank in St. Louis. When it failed, he grinned at the fellows who twitted him of his loss and said, "Oh, come easy, go easy." A few years ago, he subscribed to a matrimonial paper, and one day he appeared at the office of the probate judge with a mail-order wife, who, when they had been married a few years, went to an orphan asylum and got a mail-order baby. We have had considerable sport with mail-order Petrie, and he has become so used to it that he likes it. Sometimes on dull days, he comes around to the office to tell us what a bargain he got at this or that mail-order house. And last summer he came in to tell us about a great bargain in a cemetery lot in a new cemetery being laid out in Kansas City. He bought it on the installment plan, $1 down and 25 cents a month, to be paid until he died, and he bragged a great deal about his shrewdness in getting the lot on those terms. He chuckled as he said that he would be dead in 5 years at the most, and would have a $75 lot for a mere song. He made us promise that when that time does come, we will write up his obsequies under the head of a mail-order funeral. He added, as he stood with his hand on the door screen, that he had no use for the preachers and the hypocrites in the churches in this town, and that he was taking a paper called the Magazine of Mysteries that teaches some new ideas on religion, and that he expects to wind up in a mail-order heaven. And this is the material with which we do our day's work. Mail-order Petrie, Marshall Ferguson, the pretty girls in the flower parade, the wise club women, the cut-glass society crowd, the proud owner of the automobile, the respectable parties concerned, the proprietor of the Golden Eagle, the clerks in the Beehive, the country crook who aspires to be a professional criminal one day, the leading citizen who spends much of his time seeing the sights of his country, the college boys who wear funny clothes and ribbons on their hats, and the politicians greedy for free advertising. They are ordinary two-legged men and women, and if there is one thing more than any other that marks our town, it is its charity, and the mercy that is at the bottom of all its real impulses. Our business seems to outsiders to be a cruel one, because we have to deal as mere business with such sacred things as death and birth, the meeting and parting of friends, and with tragedies as well as with comedies. This is true. Every man, even a piano tuner, thinks his business leads him a dog's life, and that it shows him only the seamy side of the world. But our business, though it shows the seams, shows us more of good than of bad in men. We are not cynics in our office, for we know in 1,000 ways that the world is good. We know that at the end of the day we have set down more good deeds than bad deeds, and that the people in our town will keep the telephone bell ringing tomorrow more to praise the recital of a good action than they will to talk to us about some evil thing that we had to print. Time and again we have been surprised at the charity of our people. They are always willing to forgive, and be it man or woman who takes a misstep in our town, which is the counterpart of hundreds of American towns, if the offender shows that he wishes to walk straight, 1,000 hands are stretched out to help him and guide him. It is not true that a man or woman who makes a mistake is eternally damned by his fellows. If one persists in wrong after the first misdeed, it is not because sheltering love and kindness were not thrown around the wrongdoer. We have in our town women who have done wrong and have lived down their errors just as men do, and have been forgiven. 100 times in our office we have talked these things over and have been proud of our people and their humanity. We are all neighbors and friends, and when sorrow comes, no one is alone. The town's greatest tragedies have proved the town's sympathy and have been worth their cost. The end. Now, in 1921, tragedy touched William Allen White when his 16-year-old daughter Mary was killed by a fall from a horse. White wrote her obituary, which was published in the Emporia Gazette on May 17th of that year. The Associated Press reports carrying the news of Mary White's death declared that it came as a result of a fall from a horse. How she would have hooted at that. She never fell from a horse in her life. Horses have fallen on her and with her. I'm always trying to hold him in my lap, she used to say. But she was proud of few things, and one of them was that she could ride anything that had 4 legs and hair. Her death resulted not from a fall, but from a blow on the head which fractured her skull, and the blow came from the limb of an overhanging tree on the parking. The last hour of her life was typical of its happiness. She came home from a day's work at school, topped off by a hard grind with the copy on the high school annual, and felt that a ride would refresh her. She climbed into her khakis, chattering to her mother about the work she was doing, and hurried to get her horse and be out on the dirt roads for the country air and the radiant green fields of spring. As she rode through town on an easy gallop, she kept waving at passers-by. She knew everyone in town. For a decade, the little figure in the long pigtail and the red hair ribbon has been a familiar on the streets of Emporia, and she got in the way of speaking to those who nodded at her. She passed the cars, walking the horse in front of the Normal Library, and waved at them, passed another friend a few 100 feet farther on, and waved at her. The horse was walking, and as she turned into North Merchant Street, she took off her cowboy hat, and the horse swung into a lope. She passed the Trippets and waved her cowboy hat at them, still moving gaily north on Merchant Street. A Gazette carrier passed, a high school boyfriend, and she waved at him, but with her bridle hand. The horse veered quickly, plunged into the parking where the low-hanging limb faced her, and while she still looked back waving, the blow came. But she did not fall from the horse. She slipped off, dazed a bit, staggered, and fell in a faint. She never quite recovered consciousness. But she did not fall from the horse, neither was she riding fast. A year or so ago she used to go like the wind, but that habit was broken, and she used the horse to get into the open, to get fresh, hard exercise, and to work off a certain surplus energy that welled up in her and needed a physical outlet. The need has been in her heart for years. It was back of the impulse that kept the dauntless little brown-clad figure on the streets and the country roads of the community and built into a strong, muscular body what had been a frail and sickly frame during the first years of her life. But the riding gave her more than a body. It released a gay and hearty soul. She was the happiest thing in the world. And she was happy because she was enlarging her horizon. She came to know all sorts and conditions of men. Charlie O'Brien, the traffic cop, was one of her best friends. W.L. Holtz, the Latin teacher, was another. Tom O'Connor, farmer politician, and the Reverend J.H. Rice, preacher and police judge, and Frank Beach, music master, were her special friends. And all the girls, black and white, above the track and below the track, in Pepville and Stringtown, were among her acquaintances, and she brought home riotous stories of her adventures. She loved to frolic. Persiflage was her natural expression at home. Her humor was a continual bubble of joy. She seemed to think in hyperbole and metaphor. She was mischievous without malice, as full of faults as an old shoe. No angel was Mary White, but an easy girl to live with, for she never nursed a grouch 5 minutes in her life. With all her eagerness for the out-of-doors, she loved books. On her table when she left her room were a book by Conrad, one by Galsworthy, Creative Chemistry by E. Slosson, and a Kipling book. She read Mark Twain, Dickens, and Kipling before she was 10, all of their writings. Wells and Arnold Bennett particularly amused and diverted her. She was entered as a student in Wellesley for 1922, was assistant editor of the high school annual this year, and in line for election to the editorship next year. She was a member of the executive committee of the high school YWCA. Within the last 2 years, she had begun to be moved by an ambition to draw. She began, as most children do, by scribbling in her school books, funny pictures. She bought cartoon magazines and took a course, rather casually, naturally, for she was, after all, a child with no strong purposes. And this year she tasted the first fruits of success by having her pictures accepted by the high school annual. But the thrill of delight she got when Mr. Ecord, of the normal annual, asked her to do the cartooning for that book this spring was too beautiful for words. She fell to her work with all her enthusiastic heart. Her drawings were accepted, and her pride, always repressed by a lively sense of the ridiculous figure she was cutting, was really gorgeous to see. No successful artist ever drank a deeper draught of satisfaction than she took from the little fame her work was getting among her schoolfellows. In her glory, she almost forgot her horse, but never her car. For she used the car as a jitney bus. It was her social life. She never had a party in all her nearly 17 years. Wouldn't have one. But she never drove a block in her life that she didn't begin to fill the car with pickups. Everybody rode with Mary White. White and black, old and young, rich and poor, men and women. She liked nothing better than to fill the car with the long-legged high school boys and an occasional girl and parade the town. She never had a date, nor went to a dance, except once with her brother Bill, and the boy proposition didn't interest her, yet. But young people, great spring-breaking, varnish-cracking, fender-bending, door-sagging carloads of kids, gave her great pleasure. Her zests were keen. But the most fun she ever had in her life was acting as chairman of the committee that got up the big turkey dinner for the poor folks at the county home. Scores of pies, gallons of slaw, jam, cakes, preserves, oranges, and a wilderness of turkey were loaded into the car and taken to the county home. And being of a practical turn of mind, she risked her own Christmas dinner to see that the poor folks actually got it all. Not that she was a cynic, she just disliked to tempt folks. While there, she found a blind man, very old, who could do nothing but make rag rugs, and she rustled up from her school friends rags enough to keep him busy for a season. The last engagement she tried to make was to take the guests at the county home out for a car ride. And the last endeavor of her life was to try and get a restroom for the black girls in the high school. She found one girl reading in the toilet because there was no better place for a black girl to loaf, and it inflamed her sense of injustice, and she became a nagging harpy to those who she thought could remedy the evil. The poor she always had with her and was glad of it. She hungered and thirsted for righteousness, and was the most impious creature in the world. She joined the church without consulting her parents, not particularly for her soul's good. She never had a thrill of piety in her life, and would have hooted at a testimony. But even as a little child, she felt the church was an agency for helping people to more of life's abundance, and she wanted to help. She never wanted help for herself. Clothes meant little to her. It was a fight to get a new rig on her, but eventually a harder fight to get it off. She never wore a jewel and had no ring but her high school class ring, and never asked for anything but a wristwatch. She refused to have her hair up, though she was nearly 17. "Mother," she protested, "you don't know how much I get by with in my braided pigtails that I could not with my hair up." Above every other passion of her life was her passion not to grow up, to be a child. The tomboy in her, which was big, seemed loath to be put away forever in skirts. She was a Peter Pan who refused to grow up. Her funeral yesterday at the Congregational Church was as she would have wished it. No singing, no flowers except the big bunch of red roses from her brother Bill's Harvard classmen. Heavens, how proud that would have made her. And the red roses from the Gazette forces, in vases, at her head and feet. A short prayer, Paul's beautiful essay on love from the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Some remarks about her democratic spirit by her friend, John H. J. Rice, pastor and police judge, which she would have deprecated if she could. A prayer sent down for her by her friend, Carl Now, and, opening the service, a slow, poignant movement from Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, which she loved. And closing the service, a cutting from the joyously melancholy first movement of Tchaikovsky's Pathetic Symphony, which she liked to hear, in certain moods, on the phonograph, then the Lord's Prayer by her friends in high school. That was all. For her pallbearers, only her friends were chosen, her Latin teacher, W. L. Holtz, her high school principal, Rice Brown, her doctor, Frank von Cannon, her friend, W. W. Finney, her pal at the Gazette office, Walter Hughes, and her brother Bill. It would have made her smile to know that her friend, Charlie O'Brien, the traffic cop, had been transferred from 6th and Commercial to the corner near the church to direct her friends who came to bid her goodbye. A rift in the clouds, in a gray day, threw a shaft of sunlight upon her coffin as her nervous, energetic little body sank to its last sleep. But the soul of her, the glowing, gorgeous, fervent soul of her, surely was flaming in eager joy upon some other dawn. The end. Thank you very much for joining me, and have a good week.